Hello and welcome to Thoughtful of the Day. My name's Laura, for those of you who don't know me, and we're going to be reflecting upon Psalm 139. But first, a story. I remember a few years ago sitting at the bedside of a lady who was dying in hospital. She was slipping in and out of consciousness as her daughters stood around her bedside. But as she laid there, slumped, tears fell down her face of a pain that she could not quite tell, and upon her lips were the mutterings of a child. I'm bad. I've done things wrong. I'm sorry. I'm naughty. She would repeat this over and over and over again. Her daughters obviously told her that's not who they saw in this bed, that she was loved and that she was in fact the opposite. As her daughters left, I had the privilege of remaining with her, with the hospital chaplain. We read Psalm 23 together, holding each other's hands as smiling at one another, her skin papery thin. And as we did so, and as she slipped in and out of consciousness, she would recall past hurts, those shame-filled secrets that she had never told anyone before, those regrets which she wished she had done and that she wished she hadn't have done. And each time the chaplain would reassure her of forgiveness, would reassure her that she was loved and held. And as we continued to do so, each time she would look a little lighter, a little less sad, a little less slumped. Unburdened of her pain and healed, a few hours later, she passed away. This lady who had shared her deepest, darkest moments with us was healed and unburdened of her pain because she was seen and heard and loved without condemnation and judgment. Psalm 139 is not often seen as a confessional psalm, but I'd like to think that it is. It's a psalm which confesses that we too are seen and known and loved and heard by God without any judgment or condemnation. Verses 1 to 9 say this: O Lord, you have searched me out and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You mark out my journeys and my resting place, and are acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word on my tongue, but you, O Lord, know it altogether. You encompass me behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, so high I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I climb up to heaven, you're there. If I make the grave my bed, you are there also. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, your right hand hold me fast. When we know these truths about God and about ourselves, when we feel seen and not judged, those shame-filled moments of our lives are able to fall away and we're able to receive and know forgiveness. I don't know about you, but for me, sometimes the idea that God knows everything about me can feel a bit scary and is a bit of a difficult one to swallow. I wonder if you've ever experienced God's knowing and seeing as something as judgmental rather than grace-filled. I wonder if God's knowing and seeing of you has ever felt like you have to be the right person in the right place at the right time, doing the right things. Or I wonder if God's knowing of you has ever felt like a resting with God in your deepest, darkest moments and in your highest, lightest times. Or I wonder if God's knowing and seeing of you, God's love and compassion and grace has ever felt a little bit too much, and so you fled and hid. Like Adam and Eve fled and hid. The shame of what they had done and who they were, too much for them to bring themselves to God, the God who loved them and knew them, who made them. They thought that God couldn't find them. They thought that they could flee from God's Spirit. And so they no longer walked hand in hand with God in the garden, but unravelled themselves from God's life-giving embrace. I wonder if you have ever fled and hid, like King David fled and hid. But the shame of who he was and what he had done took him in a different direction. As he fled and as he hid, he wrote and he prayed. He knew that he couldn't flee God's Spirit. He knew that whether he climbed up to the heavens or made his bed in a grave, whether he dwelt in the deepest, darkest trenches of the sea, God's hand would hold him steady. David knew that despite all that he had done wrong, and he had done a lot wrong, God would continue to know and see and love him. And this knowing was the same knowing that had taken place in the Garden of Eden thousands of years before. Throughout Psalm 139, the word yada is used to describe God's knowing of us. It's the same word which is also used when Adam knew Eve and a son was conceived. God's knowledge of us is an intimate one. It's a kind of knowing that doesn't just know the facts of a person, but the depths of their very soul. It's a kind of knowing that says through thick and thin, in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health, I am all in and I will give my all to you, my body, my heart, my strength and my soul. It's a kind of knowing which embraces and encompasses, enfolds and encircles. It's an entwining of one being with another. It's a kind of knowing in which you can be comforted with just a look. A kind of knowing in which you can be comforted just in the silence. The kind of knowing where there is no judgment or shame, just patience and love and fierce compassion. The kind of knowing in your soul which holds out hope and says, they'll be back. And this kind of knowledge is hard for us to sometimes get our heads around. And in life there are definitely glimpses of it for us, those moments when we too feel really seen and really heard by another. But it can be so difficult to get our heads around because this psalm tells us that we are unable to yada God. We're unable to know God in the same intimate way that God knows us. We're only able to do that with those around us. In fact, the word for our knowledge of God is da'at, and it means facts. So whilst God can intimately know us, we can only really know truth about God. And so whilst God fully knows and sees us, we cannot fully know and see God, even if our thoughts of God outnumber the grains of sand on the shore. And I don't know about you, but for me, that's a comfort. At first I thought I would really love to know God in the way that God knows me. But actually, it's a comfort to know that the God who made the universe, the God who made me, who knitted me together in my mother's womb, who knew me without a body, who wonderfully and fearfully made me in secret, knows me better than I could ever know myself or know God. It's a comfort because God knows and searches my heart. He knows my thoughts. She knows my shame, those things which are hidden and those things which are exposed. God knows those things which are mine to carry and those moments of shame which should have never been placed upon my shoulders. Those things which I dislike about myself and those things which perhaps I like a little too much about myself. And yet within this comfort is an uncomfortable truth. Because in order to live a life in all of its fullness, or to be led into a life everlasting, as David puts it at the end of this psalm, something is also required of me to do so. Something which Adam and Eve were unable to do. A reach of the hand and an opening of ourselves to allow ourselves to be seen in those moments of shame. It requires an emergence from our hiding places and a courage to speak the truth that we are known and yet are still loved in the times when it would just be easier to think ill of ourselves. Brothers and sisters, it is in doing this that we confess that God is our creator. God is a God of the universe, the sea, the sun, the sky, and of us. And in turn, our lives become witness to the truth as we walk hand in hand with love, always seen and always known. We are then able to walk hand in hand with others, unguarded and unashamed, thus freeing others to be open to the possibility and truth that they too could live in this way, forgiven and known and loved. This week, may you too know God's gaze upon you. May you feel seen and heard. And may you create that space for others to be seen and heard too. Amen.